Hello and welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our first event of the semester. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Tanilian, the director of the Center for Armenian Studies here at the University of Michigan. We are virtually today as we've had an extreme rise of positive COVID cases here in Michigan that have affected also some members of our community. So we, of course, very much hope that we will return to in-person meetings as soon as possible, and we will monitor the situation very closely. Before I begin, I would like to thank Makhdoumian, our program specialist who's behind the scenes and is running the tech side of things today. And for our audience, you will be able, of course, to submit your questions as always on the bottom of your screen via the question and answer function. And we will gladly answer and entertain your question, and I'm looking very much forward to your engagement. So, but let me move on to introduce today's speaker, one of the center's excellent Manoogian postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Helen Makhdoumian. Dr. Makhdoumian comes to us from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she received her PhD in the English department in 2021, and she graduated from the English department, but has also worked or received additional degrees. There's a minor in Native American and Indigenous studies, as well as a certificate in the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies, as well as in interpretive theory. Her focus are authors of Armenian heritage in the diaspora, as her list of publication highlights. Her most recent article, Connected Memory Spaces of Silence in Michelin's Aharoyan Markham's Draining the Sea, was published in Modern Fiction Studies. She has also published in the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies in 2017, and I believe has a forthcoming article in that journal's upcoming thematic issue on indigeneity. And of course, in addition, if one looks at Dr. Makhdoumian's CV, there's a long list of public-facing online publications that really speak to her commitment to academia, the field of Armenian studies, teaching, and I would say most importantly, perhaps her passion for critical theory. Her research and career has been supported by many grants and fellowships, really indicating her success and also position her as one of the most promising early career scholars in her field and beyond that. Dr. Makhdoumian's work is original, and it has been the object of much praise. And the originality lies in its theoretical innovation and also linking fields of memory studies that have until now been treated quite separately. And as many of you know, it is one of our key missions here at the Program for Armenian Studies to reach into broader theoretical and methodological conversations that occupy really the humanities and social science more broadly. And Dr. Makhdoumian's work is exemplary of this approach, and her talk today will give you a glimpse of the possibilities when we look beyond our field-specific geographically and temporally defined silos. Today's talk draws on Dr. Makhdoumian's fantastic dissertation titled A Map of Displace, Memory and the Afterlives of Removal. In the dissertation, Makhdoumian develops the original concept of nested memories. And I will not elaborate on this, as she will do so in her talk. And of course, she is no doubt much better positioned to explain her intervention into memory studies than I am. More generally, Dr. Makhdoumian's dissertation, now being turned, of course, into a book manuscript while she's here at the university, is a powerful move to push Armenian studies into new directions. It is a push to open additional lines of inquiry by using the category of the indigeneity to reframe questions of place, space, movement, and belonging as they are articulated in, as she mentions, in transnational and transcultural memory studies. By reading side by side contemporary novels and memoirs of Armenian American, Palestinian Americans, and American Indian First Nations, Dr. Makhdoumian illustrates how memories of dispossession and removal travel across time, generations, and geographies. Ultimately, she writes, her combined reading and, I quote, interpretations of literary text authored by Palestinian, Armenian, and Native Americans allows her to bring Indigenous studies and settler colonial studies to the center of the study of the migration of memory, memory and migration, and the memory of migration. End of quote. Dr. Makhdoumian identifies her authors as witnesses to disappearing history, and therein carefully and I would say empathetically exposes the structure of a multi-generational transmission of memory that is defined by a persistence and recurrent collective trauma. And this exposition allows Dr. Makhdoumian to move, as we will see, towards a theorization of what she has coined nested memory. And with that, I am very excited to hear more about your new theoretical interventions. And yeah, Dr. Makhdoumian, the floor is yours. So you would have to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, I think I have successfully. And if I have not, then you will tell me.
Wonderful. And I will leave you to it.
Awesome. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Good evening, or perhaps wherever you might be in the morning, the afternoon. Thank you, Melanie, for that introduction. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the program, of course, as you made my presence here possible tonight, and to Naira for making all of this run smoothly, especially as we transition from a hybrid format into a fully virtual event. And of course, a thank you to you, the audience, for being here with me digitally tonight, as I share with you how I come to and I work through the concept of what I call nested memory. So I'm going to screen share my slides with you and go from there. Give me 1 second. Perfect. Excellent. All right. And so I know that I'm addressing several different audiences tonight, and I want to begin by inviting everyone into the space of my research, and to do so to establish a common language for exchange tonight and perhaps into the future. So to that end, I want to delineate 3 avenues of critical inquiry that inform my research broadly, and that will come up tonight and throughout my talk. As you'll see, I situate my work in Armenian studies as a contribution to the larger field of contemporary cultural memory studies. So for me, that means working along 3 different axes of inquiry. So broadly, we might say migration of memory in the field of cultural memory studies. That means thinking about the ways that memory moves across sociocultural and geopolitical borders, how it moves and is mobilized across media and form and kind of transformed in those ways. The second axis of inquiry that we might think of concerns migration and memory. So in this kind of mode of thinking, we can look at the ways that immigrants become legible or not legible in a state polity based on their participation in state memory work. And in the final axis of inquiry, what I think of as memory of migration, I phrase it that way because often in critical memory studies, we think about violence as attacks against the body. So we might think about memory of concentration camps, we might think about memory of massacre, but not always do we think about the mobility of memory specific to an experience of exile or forced migration or deportation. And so to me, it's important to name that we're looking at the memory of migration itself. And I want to note that while I've used the term migration to ground us tonight in this meaning-making process, that when I analyze Armenian American, Palestinian American, and American Indian literary text, I strategically am using the word removal and not just migration. And I use the word removal because it's terminology invoked in each of these cases, whether that's in scholarship or through lived experiences, but also because the word removal allows me to name the agency of political actors who initiate population movement policies, rather than assuming that these communities somehow chose to migrate on their own, right? It is naming that is active and that there are geopolitical concerns that are propelling these forced migrations. So that's why I end up choosing to work with removal, even as I've given you these axes of inquiry. On this note of foundation building, I want to turn to the core of my presentation and this notion of nested memory. So what does the structure of the intergenerational transmission of memory look like? That question has driven others in the field, including Mariana Hirsch notably, who has developed the framework of post-memory. That question of transmission is also the one that will guide my study of the migration of memory in the context of the afterlife of removal. More specifically, my talk today takes inspiration from the space-time nexus depicted in Nancy Krikorian's poem Homage to Burj Ahmud, and in so doing offers nested memory as a model to open alternative perspectives. So in this sense, we could say nesting defines the structure of the transmission of memory in the face of the recursivity of trauma. Where nesting refers to the ways in which an inherited memoryscape of cultural trauma is then folded into another memoryscape of descendants who become witnesses in their own right to collective violence. Nesting also encompasses the emplacement of memory, meaning memory work is always geographically located somewhere, given that diasporas establish nests or communities in the wake of removal. Now, attention to the space-time nexus depicted in Homage to Burj Ahmud serves as a useful entry point to prioritize the descendant as a witness in the study of the transmission of memory. So the last stanza of the poem reads, "Remember nor Adana, nor Marash, nor Sis, men still play backgammon and grill meat on braziers on the sidewalk. Remember the narrow alleys and the wooden houses of Sanjak camp raised for a shopping plaza. O people of long memory, listen, look, speak, remember, your stories are homeland." So in terms of space, we could say that Krikorian's use of the grammatical a in the seventh and last stanza opens polysemy for a taken for granted term in the case of the post-1915 Armenian diaspora. Given the narrative arc of the prose poem, homeland at first points to land from which Armenians were removed in the genocidal process for the catastrophe. But if we look at the depiction of upbuilding of Armenian communities in dispersion, then a homeland in this last line comes instead to apply a home on land away from the homeland. So the first, meaning the homeland, emphasizes sites of dispossession and forced migration, whereas the latter, a homeland, emphasizes sites of arrival. So in this vein, the speaker's prompts call attention to how inherited traumatic memories from the site of violence in the homeland can be folded into descendants' own memory work. Prompted by collective violence they experience in a homeland, a diasporic community. They're all at the beginning of all but one of the 7 stanzas. The speaker orients the people of long memory to listen to look at, to speak of, and to ultimately remember experiences of survival in dispersion. The middle part of the poem focuses on the flowering of refugees and their children who name the neighborhoods of Burj Ahmud their home, the word nor, of course, meaning new in Armenian, and the places from which they were displaced. The speaker continues, the remnants of Marash create a new Marash, and also nor Sis, nor Adana, nor Giliya, and nor Hajin. So removed from our Anatolian homeland in the context of Ottoman Empire, we remnants were refugees settled and resettled under policies of population transfer overseen by the League of Nations, the French mandate, British mandate, and developed in the service of what Laura Robinson has called constructing internationally sanctioned forms of the imperial control of the Levant. It's in that context of population transfer and the entanglements of empires in which we're caught that I turn to the poem to underscore the need to conceptualize the intergenerational transmission of memory in space, but also in terms of spaces in relation to one another. As the poem exemplifies, that means understanding in the Armenian case, memory that continues to be generated in our homeland and in the nests we establish. My choice of terminology, nest, nested, nesting, is no mere coincidence. So in a 2015 photography book on the contemporary community of Burj Ahmud, of course, Makhdoumian identifies the place as the bird's nest. It's a title that recalls the bird's nest orphanage in Byblos, once home to Armenian youth who survived the death marches. And of course, the poem features an epigraph that reads, "Have you heard a thrush sing while its nest burns in the wind?" So the metaphor of nesting proves doubly useful here in that the poem depicts not just spatial nesting of memory, as refugees call this new place home, but the temporal nesting of memory, when remnants and their descendants are exiled once again. That is, from references to removal and to orphanages, The poem further unwinds through the Lebanese Civil War of 1975 to 1990, and ultimately to the present in 2008, or the moment when the wooden houses of Sanjak camp are on the cusp of being raised for a shopping plaza. So the poem depicts how its Armenian community creates nests. Its structure exemplifies how one memory gets nested into the narration of another. The fourth stanza begins, "Speak of those times or don't, when the parties take up arms against each other." Alludes to the ways in which present-day inhabitants recall what happened among and between Armenians of Beirut in 1958, as if understanding that earlier conflict is necessary to understanding the later one. This is what Nancy tells us about her own contextual work and historiographical work that produced this poem. Now, in the prose poem, Krikorian situates memories of loss and rebuilding associated with exile in the context of genocide as necessary to understanding what the prose poem locates as collective traumas that will later occur. The 1958 Lebanon crisis, and of course the Lebanese Civil War later on in 1975. After all, the poem situates this narrative of possibility, the flowering of remnants, as a necessary memory to recall in the face of future upheaval, and the envisioned impossibility of rebuilding from the ashes once again. Reference to the war, the penultimate stanza concludes, "Carrying leather suitcases to the airports, so many are exiled again." Passive voice obscures agent, allowing Krikorian to emphasize the recursive experience of exile. And the space-time nexus also calls attention to the ways in which descendants who bear witness to traumatic past then themselves witness mass violence. To understand this duality of bearing witness and then witnessing means to recognize the agency of the descendant. And when we recognize the agency of the descendant, nested memory allows us to revisit what Hirsch says about post-memory. She writes, "To grow up with overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth or one's consciousness, is to risk having one's life stories displaced, even evacuated by one's ancestors. But as the novels I take up in my project illustrate, the characters are represented as mobilizing inherited traumatic memories to make meaning of their own experiences of displacement. So not an evacuation, but an active connection." So in developing nested memory work as a rubric for the study of the multi-generational contact points of memory, when an already displaced people is displaced again, I also utilize the work of Mohawk theorist and anthropologist Audra Simpson, and particularly the work of what she calls nested sovereignty. Simpson proffers the rubric of refusal as a political science framework, when she argues that Mohawks, like other Iroquois people, refuse the gifts of American and Canadian citizenship, and instead insist upon the integrity of Iroquois Confederacy governance. So in tracing the implications of refusal, Simpson argues that one sovereign political order can exist nested within a sovereign state. So in other words, Mohawks live and move within a territorial space that is overlaid with settler regimes, while refusing to stop politically being Iroquois, and instead practicing communal belonging and citizenship as Indigenous nationals. Come back to this later as I think through what this might mean for Armenian studies as memory arrives into this particular space. But for now, nested memory proves useful insofar as nested sovereignty proves useful in that spatializing where the intergenerational transmission of memory takes place can hold a mirror to the ways in which diaspora is taken for granted in memory studies. While addressing homeland, homemaking, nationhood, diaspora as a rubric in memory studies has tended not to also encompass indigeneity, not to address questions of occupation and settler coloniality, or to conceptualize resistant memories as set against nation-state sponsored active disappearance of history in the wake of removal. So in the chapter from which I extract this talk, as Melanie mentioned earlier, I contrapuntally read different canons. And in this case, in this chapter, I'm reading Patricia Serafian Ward's The Bullet Collection, Susan Abulhawa's Mornings in Janine, and Linda Hogan, who's a Chickasaw author, her novel Solar Storms. So given the scope of time that we have and the kind of context in which I'm speaking today, I'll focus on the Bullet Collection while gesturing to these other novels. The core notion of traumatic knowledge is having the potential to be passed vertically between child and parent within a family and horizontally across contemporary members of the second generation certainly appears in these novels. Still, Ward, Abulhawa, and Hogan depict axes of connected memory work and imaginative investment beyond the first and second generation binary. Additionally, the nesting of memory pertaining to removal doesn't appear the same across these novels. So in Ward's novel, the marginalized narrative of genocide reveals the difficulty in trying to make meaning of two different forms of mass violence, each marked by its own respective event structure relationality. While the experience of exile comes to the fore as a point of comparison in the novel, knowledge of dispossession becomes a lost archive. In Abulhawa's novel, In Mornings in Jenin, nested memory work reveals how succeeding acts of violence engender a narrativization of the 1948 Nakba, both as an event and as a structure, given memory work unfolds in the space of ongoing occupation, and as such, the Nakba is experienced as a continued presence. Finally, in Hogan's novel, Nested Memory Work reveals that there's no naming of settlers' dispossession of Indigenous peoples as an event. So we might say that while the proper names of the 1915 catastrophe, 1948 catastrophe, in Armenian-Palestinian cases respectively, we could ask whether any native languages use a word that we could also translate into English as catastrophe. So we might say, do we in English invoke the 1492 catastrophe? And the answer would be no, but that's something to think about. So ultimately, in Hogan's novel, the removal of the protagonist from her family by the state is situated within a history of early settlement, within federal removal policy, within the boarding and residential school system, and within a river damming project in the present. So as I said, I won't be able to dive into Mornings in Jenin and Solar Storms given the scope, but I want to now turn specifically to the bullet collection and focus on that novel. Let's go back. And provide you first with an overview of the structure. The bullet collection begins with a 2-page prelude in which the first-person narrator, Mariana, remembers her youth in Lebanon before its ethnic and sectarian civil war. She recalls the past from her position as an 18-year-old in an unidentified U.S. New England town, 8 months after her family is exiled there from Beirut. Mariana has an older sister, Elaine, who collects war debris, including bullets and shrapnel, and so the novel refers to Elaine's accumulation of the material ravages of war. But the title also aptly encapsulates Mariana's archival memory of her time in Beirut. A bullet, of course, refers to a projectile fired from a gun, but it can also mean a bullet point, a typographical symbol used to introduce and organize items in a list. Bullet points could be single words, short phrases, sentences, or paragraphs. And other than for complete sentences, bullet points tend not to end with a period or full stop. So the novel's structure exemplifies Mariana's attempts to order and make meaning of her memories pertaining to the events of the Lebanese Civil War. And it also exemplifies the resulting temporal disorientation and the attempt to narrate a period of collective violence that has not yet passed. So war continues back home while she and her family attempt to establish a sense of home in the US. So it's through this narrative structure we see the nesting of memory. The novel, as it's presented, is about Mariana's recollections of events of the Lebanese Civil War, but if we dive in, we see that the narration is indexing the transmission of memory pertaining to the Armenian genocide. Pause and grab some water there. So nested memory work in the novel demonstrates the continuum between what Alida Osman has called the canon, or the actively circulated memory that keeps the past present, and what she calls the archive, or the passively stored memory that preserves the past as past. In the novel, certain aspects of collective memory of genocide come to the fore, including the experience of establishing a home and dispersion, while others remain in the archive, decontextualized and disconnected from their former frames of inquiry, former frames of representation and meaning. By the latter, I mean the broader history of removal and dispossession. So to connect this back to the prose poem of Homage to Burj Hamoud, we can say that the prose poem proves useful in illuminating Ward's novel because Ward also depicts spaces of diasporic memory work in relation to one another. Scenes from Beirut during the war disrupt the main narrative arc, which itself consists of the out-of-order memories Mariana strings together concerning her family's initial arrival in the US, her resistance to her family's desire to leave behind the past, and then her conclusion that her initial belief just a while longer no longer holds true because the US becomes a permanent home. And then the novel itself is organized around 3 sections in the following order: autumn, summer, and winter. One strain of the novel takes place in Rome, where Mariana's cousin is himself exiled. And in the novel, Mariana's grandfather and great uncle are genocide survivors. They, alongside Mariana's grandmother and great aunt, are the living connection to genocide. And it's along those 3 generational narrative arcs that I'll break down my analysis and orient you to this particular novel. So the first way I want to orient you to this novel is to think about the ways that the word presents Mariana, the protagonist, as a witness to the events versus the event in totality of the Lebanese Civil War. So Ward in the novel provides two prefaces in which Mariana's narration appears in italics. The first preface, that's italicized, appears at the start of autumn and features the refrain, "Before the war was real." On the one hand, the refrain, "Before the war was real," points to a moment in the narrative when Mariana remembers a night during a ceasefire. She observes, "Grown-ups discuss the ceasefire with new excitement, rehashing memories from a time that had nothing to do with me." A neighbor, Mrs. Awad, asked Mariana, "Do you know your parents took you all over Lebanon before the war?" So in this way, we could say that Ward develops a character who embodies a member of what in Lebanon is known as the war generation. And that is coming from a particular body of scholarship. And here I'm citing Chad Elias and posthumous images. This generation, or individuals born between the mid-1960s and early 70s, has a particularly close and complicated relationship to the war, having experienced much of it unfolding as adolescents. The preface then exemplifies this generation's search for origins and an attempt to imagine a past not marked by war. In this way, the preface draws out the positive memories of life outside of upheaval and positive memories that are transmitted to Mariana and nested into her own memory state, because again, she's relying on the neighbor and others in the community of the time before the war. On the other hand, the refrain, "Before the war was real," captures the several stages of what would later become known in totality as the Lebanese Civil War. It underscores how one can remember events within a larger structural violence. That is, Ward does not capitalize the word war in any invocation of the phrase or at any point in the novel. Nor does she provide the proper name of the Lebanese Civil War. Now, more broadly, critics of Lebanese art and literature have argued that the phrases Lebanese Civil War, post-war, post-Civil War are misnomers. That is, the period of war between 1975 and 1990 covers more than one singular event, and those events of violence span from the course of a few minutes to individual days, longer periods such as weeks, months, or years. In that sense, critics have suggested that civil wars, plural, might actually best describe that 15-year period of violence overseen by sectarian alliances and actors. If we are to return to the image of the ceasefire, Ward employs the pronoun "this" in Mariana's version of that night. She also uses it when Mariana's father observes, "This ceasefire won't last long." Read in conversation with the repeated invocation of "this," the refrain "Before the war was real" reflects the ways in which the war becomes real over and over again because the fighting stops and picks up again. If we also bring the refrain "Before the war was real" in conversation with the title, we can see how in Mariana's narrative, Ward nests memories of one phase of the war into another. So in observing that this is how we left home, Mariana portrays how she witnesses the militias which went to war for West Beirut, and that marked the 3rd phase. She refers to the 4th phase of the collective violence, when she watches from an apartment balcony the arrival of Syrian soldiers who empty her neighborhood of Palestinians, just as, she writes, or she reflects, had been taken away like this years ago. The qualification "like this" demonstrates how to conceptualize the totality of the Civil War means to understand one event in relation to another, and also one phase in relation to another. Finally, she describes the events, the start of the war, the night her family celebrates her grandmother's birthday, and it's the night when partygoers head to Beirut and find themselves ensnared in traffic because of the busload of Palestinians that have been attacked by the Falange Party. The second italicized preface appears at the start of winter, but this time Ward shifts to the present tense. So where we had "before the war was real," we have "before the war is real." Mariana now narrates her experience of having lived through the events of collective violence back home in Lebanon by reframing memory she has of visiting a butcher's shop with her mother and the childhood crush that she has on the shop owner's son. Whereas Before the War Was Real marks the repeated attempts to narrate life in Beirut before violence, the singular iteration Before the War Is Real now marks the attempts to narrate memory of collective violence in its totality that she experienced before being exiled to the US. The preposition before, however, captures how the past is not yet past in Ward's literary representation of the effects of war on this particular generation. The creative remediation is reflective of lived conditions in Lebanon. So as anthropologist Sami Hermes has argued, there's been a tendency in Lebanon to perceive the war as something in the past without its ongoing structural effects. That understanding of the period of 75 to 1990 as collected as singular, he writes, raises a problem because the war has not passed, not physically, as its presence is felt continually. So the second preface in the bullet collection exemplifies this tension between situating the events of the Lebanese Civil War in the past tense while recognizing the ongoing effects. That is, the preface to Winter is the only time Ward uses third-person narration while the content of the section is in the first tense and covers Mariana's confrontation with nostalgia for the home her family has left behind. Excellent. I just got distracted by the chat feature, but we're good. All right. The second way that I want to orient you to this novel is to think about the ways that Ward represents Mariana as a witness to and later narrator of the previous generation's rememory, a rememory that is experienced in the middle of war. So through Mariana's bullet collection, meaning traumatic memories pertaining to the Civil War, Ward illustrates the witnessing of a rememory and that mediation process. So in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, Sethi tells her daughter Denver the following about forgetting. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it, stays, and not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. When Denver asks in turn, can other people see it? The response is, some days you'll be walking down the road and you hear something or something going on so clearly, and you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a rememory that belongs to someone else. So in the novel, Ward establishes Mariana as a character who witnesses memory work unfolding, but doesn't recognize what takes place. By that, I mean the ways in which the adult characters are represented as calling up the past, integrating into a historically different present. So in one scene set during the war, her great uncle and his wife lose their store in Beirut because of a bomb explosion. In response to the destruction, the adults remark, how terrible to suffer so much at the beginning of their lives, and now this. Now, in her reading of Beloved, Hirsch distinguishes between rememory as a memory that's communicated through bodily symptoms, a form of repetition and reenactment, distinguished from what Hirsch conceptualizes as post-memory, a memory that works through indirection and multiple mediation. By having suffered so much at the beginning of their lives, this is the phrase that's used in the novel, the adults are referring to events of genocide, and use that past to articulate the consequences of a contemporaneous collective violence as it's unfolding. Mariana, looking back on the exchange, remarks, what I knew about being Armenian was that Gido had to travel in a suitcase when he was a child fleeing the Turks. The scene demonstrates a nesting of memory in that Mariana, looking back to the events of the Lebanese Civil War, recalls having witnessed the adults in her family discussing a traumatic past, the genocidal process. But in recalling the car bombing from a temporal remove, Mariana's memory betrays how descendants of those who experienced collective trauma participated in imaginative investments. So certainly post-memory work is there. But as Mariana puts it, the narrative of her relatives fleeing had for her in her youth seemed an adventurous way to grow up. The scene then marks the indirection of the transmission of memory, in the sense that without commentary from the adults, Mariana does not have the interpretive framework to understand the severity of her grandfather's journey, and by extension, the second upheaval of which the car bombing is part. In this way, we could return to Osman's arguments about the canon and the archive, say that Ward demonstrates how in the intergenerational inheritance of memory, or we could call the storehouse of memory, different parts of the story can be called up and resonate with the different individuals for different reasons. The meaning-making process is evident in the title and in the travels of rememory that Mariana is bumping into, what she's witnessing, that recollection, without understanding what it means. So in that same car bombing, Auntie Loopsy, rocking back and forth, claws at Mariana's arms and commands her to watch for them. They're everywhere. Mariana thinks that warning refers to potential thieves in the store. So later, Astrid, frustrated by her mother's persistent inquiry about the presence of shoppers, explains, "Oof, Mama, next you'll be looking for Turks." The mention of Turks silences Auntie Loopsy, and her face turns pale and rigid. So Mariana doesn't understand what was so terrible in her aunt's words. I'll return to the word thief and reflect upon the historicity of the novel's publication in relation to that of Armenian studies scholarship. But for now, I want to emphasize in this scene, no one informs Mariana that her aunt is referring to perpetrators. So we could say that in this scene, in the novel, historical withholding within the family results in the child witness observing a shift in affective response, but not having a comprehension of the trauma that leaves its mark. In other words, to witness how someone, as the novel presents it, can see the ghost living inside her husband doesn't result in understanding what in the present prompts that rememory, the originary violence. Okay. So the final way that I want to orient you to this novel is to think about the ways that the novel is presenting received testimony as invested with new meaning. So in depicting the decontextualization of collective memory of the Armenian genocide in its temporal and spatial migration, Ward holds the character of Vartan as a mirror to Mariana's nested memory work. So in the juxtaposition of characters' narrative arcs, a descendant, someone who would, in Hirsch's articulation, belong in part of the post-generation, would later participate in this very meaning-making process that she witnessed as a child but did not recognize as occurring. So to protect their daughters during the war, Mariana's parents send her and her sister to her mother's first cousin, Vartan, in Rome. And there, Vartan instructs the girls with, "We as Armenians do not belong anywhere, so you should make your home wherever you go and be pleased you are somewhere at all." The claims of "we have no home, we are exiles," coupled with inquiries of "do you know nothing of Armenian history," end up bothering Mariana because she can't relate at that point to the history of exile. She also dismisses that knowledge for 3 reasons. So Mariana first never thought of herself as Armenian, but Lebanese instead. Second, the notion of being homeless, of carrying that in her blood, appeals to her, but doesn't mean anything to her since her family had a home. So Vartan reiterates that her grandparents were among the first refugees to arrive in Lebanon, in the story of Jido spending part of the trip in a suitcase. But since Mariana had known that story her whole life, it doesn't actually do anything for her. It doesn't astonish her as she thinks it's meant to. And she says, "We see refugees all the time, so why is this story essentially significant?" Well, Mariana sees refugees back home. She doesn't understand that situation or the struggles because she herself hasn't been through that yet. Third, Vartan's version of the past brings to Mariana's mind Auntie Loopsy's mention of the church floors that ran red with blood, but she stops short of critically engaging the memories. Instead, she dismisses Auntie Loopsy's stories because she hadn't been there, and so it didn't count. And likewise, Mariana hadn't been there, and neither had Vartan. So across those various reasons, Ward elucidates how a child may or may not come to identify in diaspora, and how that positioning influences the individual's relationship to testimony and to witnessing. Now, indeed, in narrating her interaction with Vartan from a vantage point of being an 18-year-old exilee in the US, she reflects she could not yet understand that Vartan looked at her family through the eyes of an exile. After realizing that Vartan's exilic experience informs his obsession with the past, his guardianship of the traumatic history, Mariana reckons with the coded message, the past will never be undone. And looking back at the moment, she notes, something terrible lay in his words as if they were a prophecy whose meaning I had failed to read. So Vartan makes the claim in the context of an important period during the war, that as the girls and Vartan hear news about the killing of Bashir Gemayel and the Israeli invasion of Beirut, the massacres of Palestinians who had been left behind, and the return of multinational peacekeepers. That information that they received prompts Vartan to ask, what will become of Lebanon? That scene recalls the one from the earlier start of the war, the car bombing, in which the adults remark, how terrible to suffer so much at the beginning of their lives, and now this. That open-ended question as to what will happen to their nest in Beirut in diaspora, and the exclamation which indexes the recursivity of trauma are certainly sentiments that have emerged in the real-life context of the recent port explosion in 2020. Although the ashes are still falling in this lived case, early news reports about how the explosion has affected survivors and their kin abroad similarly demonstrates that nesting of memory, the feeling of having lived through the Lebanese civil war and now the port explosion, a disaster. How does one then come to name the phenomenon of upheaval yet again that one has just witnessed? So as Mariana passes a gate inside the airport as they're about to return back to Beirut from Rome, she suddenly turns to find Vartan, and when she can't locate him in the crowd, turns back around, claims her movement going on the plane repeats itself under her skin as she remembers her life in Beirut and their trip to Rome from a vantage point as an exile in the US much later. So in the airport, the movement sparks an affective response, and Mariana, which she observes foreshadows what Vartan's dying in the novel would mold inside her permanently, the sense of never having paid attention, of too late. But towards the end of the novel, she recalls leaving Beirut on a boat and remarks, what did I know of what was coming, of yearning, of dreams? The novel ends with Mariana venturing outside their New England home and observing as snow falls, there is indeed a future coming. She heeds Vartan's claims and begins to make this new place her home. So, in what remains of my presentation, I want to make two final strokes. The first stroke is to pull back and articulate a kind of holistic picture of what we could say, of what we could take away of the framework of nested memory as I'm thinking through it. And then second stroke, to particularize those broader arguments in relation to the potential future of Armenian studies. Now, so some kind of takeaways as I see it working on this broad corpus of texts. We could say that when we study nested memory, nesting, as I mentioned earlier, occurs given this reoccurrence of trauma. There's these kind of sites of connection that's happening generationally. That nesting, that reoccurrence, the repetition of trauma then informs the ways in which that collective violence is narrated. So then we have a narrative structure, as I pulled out from the bullet collection, about the ways that a singular event is narrated in relation to another to produce the totality of the Lebanese Civil War. So these kind of connections. We could also see it in terms of narrative structure in the ways that the inherited memoryscape of genocide comes to the fore in particular ways in relation to the study in relation to memory of the Lebanese Civil War. This is a question of genre. I am hesitant to say that it is a question of genre, in part because when I wrote this as a dissertation project, I took up memoirs in one of the chapters. As I showed you earlier, I gave you a prose poem to narrate and to produce this kind of framework. And then I ultimately looked at novels in this particular iteration, and for by and large, when I wrote this as dissertation form. And certainly, in other contexts, there's at least one poem, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's At Clo from the late 1800s, in which the narrator of that poem is thinking through violence in relation to transatlantic slavery, through Reconstruction, through the rise of the KKK, and more continued violence. So certainly, is it a question of genre? I'm not there yet. But we could say at the very least that it's a pattern in aesthetic representation that links histories of collective violence together. We could also say that in terms of nested memory, a later event of mass violence can inform what can come to the fore of testimony and vice versa. In terms of the intergenerational transmission, memory may be actively withheld and not forgotten. So in another place, I actually take up All the Light There Was, Nancy Creek-Hornan's All the Light There Was, as part of a larger chapter. And I say that we can think about the ways that rather than assuming people want to pass on memory, there is an active engagement in wanting to withhold and not just forget memory. Okay, we can think about this in relation to diaspora and transnational studies. So certainly we can think about this as nation state remembrance practices matter. That is to say, not all nation states want to remember their foundational violence, Not all nation states want to confront them or openly discuss them. And you can see that especially in settler colonial contexts. So we must recognize the grains of, let's say, collective memory on a nation state level that might not be happening, and how this intergenerational transmission is continuing to be circulated as it picks up different contexts. Certainly memory is nested within borders of the nation state that emerges. In a moment, I'll think through that in relation to diasporic sites of memory making. If we think about Lebanon in relation to, let's say, the Armenian experience in Turkey, nesting is informed by internal versus external displacement. That nation state actors and agents of succeeding violences need not be the same, though they certainly can be. We can say, for instance, in Susan Abu Hawa's Mornings in Jenin, we have the experience of the 1948 Nakba that is transmitted across generations as another generation experiences the Naksa, and then of course later the invasion, the attack on Jenin. So certainly it's happening, let's say, in one particular location. Whereas if we think about Hala Al-Yan's The Salt House is another novel that I take up. Memory does occur in the context of the Nakba, but we see Al-Yan depicting memory in Kuwait, in Jordan, in France, in Lebanon, in all of these different spaces. And certainly the positionality of the descendant or descendants beyond just inheriting cultural memory. So who are we as witnesses? Who are we as potential victims or bystanders, perhaps even perpetrators, or as Michael Rothberg would put it, implicated subjects in these other contexts? I want to note that when I'm using diaspora and transnational, a couple of caveats, that I don't hastily or haphazardly take these concepts and apply them in the context of American Indian and First Nations texts that I apply, or that I look at. Certainly, I am drawing upon a work of scholarship in Indigenous studies, including the work of Chickasaw sociocultural linguistic anthropologist Jenny Davis, who emphasizes that diaspora can indeed be useful, and in doing so, works through thinking about Indigenous and diasporic as not mutually exclusive terms, but that they can stand together and produce Indigenous diaspora. But it just means working through a particular framework of inquiry and not assuming that diaspora, as we've studied in the journal, can easily apply, or should it apply, in one-to-one relationship? The answer is it doesn't. And also from the transnational. I said a lot about the nation state, but certainly when I'm looking at American Indian and First Nations texts, I am recognizing that if we take Indigenous political sovereignty as foundational, then we think about the transnational, and even in the context of the US, now 574 federally recognized tribes throughout the US and Canada. So we're working through a transnational even before we get to the concept or the notion of the nation state of the US. So there are different frameworks. I want to put them out there as caveats and to say, I hold this unevenness in relation to one another. And then for cultural memory studies, memory work takes in place and is in place. If we are to follow the knowledge of indigeneity, Indigenous political sovereignty, then for memory studies that is focused a lot in the context of sites of violence based in Europe, that means maybe holding and thinking through memory work that is arriving and placed in context of sovereignty, nested sovereignty, understood in the context of nation and not just the nation state. And so for memory studies, that means maybe thinking through what we mean by sovereignty and thinking beyond and holding and centering Indigenous sovereignty itself. And that memory of traumatic collective violence can have cultural memories nested within it. I'll show you what this means in a moment when I think through Kevork Murad's piece of art by Kevork Murad. And of course, as our lived experience shows us, these kind of networks of collective memory allow us to produce kinship networks. So you might perhaps identify as an Iraqi Armenian or a Syrian Armenian. That experience of it perhaps living through an upheaval might allow you to connect and not connect with others in that sense of memory transmission. So to bring it all together and ultimately end on this note of imagining, of creativity and a future vision and bringing it all together, I want to note that in some ways, a study of the Bullet collection, Ward's novel, seems out of place in my talk on resurgence and remembering removal. The novel, as I said, takes place in Beirut. As I illustrated, the experience of exile resonates with descendants, while dispossession does not, precisely because they don't live through their own experience of dispossession, but rather ethnic and sectarian civil war. But those seeming omissions in the history of the Armenian genocide, as it's narrativized and then transmitted through memory work, makes the study of the novel that much more relevant. So then to imagine in Armenian studies, I want to return to that moment in the indirection of memory depicted in the novel, the moment when Mariana mistakes Auntie Lupsi's embodied recall of the perpetrators to mean a fear for the thieves in the store. So in the settler colonial context of the US and Canada, Indigenous scholars have invoked such terms as stolen land and land theft to articulate what Patrick Wolfe would come to argue in his work on the logic of elimination of Indigenous peoples. He writes, territoriality is settler colonialism's specific irreducible element, and that settler colonizers come to stay because settler colonialism erects a new colonial society on an expropriated land base. I want to emphasize that there is so much work to be done, so much inquiry and reflection on how modes of inquiry, critical inquiry, from these two distinct fields of settler colonial studies, critical Indigenous studies, might inform the study of dispossession, its violence, and its legacies in the former Ottoman Empire, and of course, diaspora. That I will say, there is no shame, but there's a plug for our conference in January. So hopefully you will join us in February when my fellow postdoc Matthew Bislarian and I and several others come together and take up that question of what we can learn from these various fields. I want to begin to make that bridge by thinking through terminology, including ared and the Medjugorje. Of course, translated to English as great crime. I know Medjugorje is problematic in several ways. I know the ways in which that it's been used for various political means and perhaps used for rhetorical gymnastics to refer to the events of violence, of what we would call Armenian genocide. So I don't think Vartan Matosyan is in the audience, but the book is in my queue. I'm getting to it. When I wrote this project in dissertation form, I suggested as part of my analysis of the novel that what has been not sufficiently been addressed, but what is implied, that terms used by survivors as witnesses encompasses not just massacre and bodily violence that seems to come to the fore with the term genocide, but other terms used at the moment would have indexed the deportation of Ottoman Armenians from their homelands, the destruction and the theft of their property, the destruction of cultural sites and material heritage, and the confiscation of territory. So in opening up a study of the Armenian genocide in this way, I want to suggest that that Ward's depiction of transference of memory devoid of that context, the context around the word thief, is symptomatic of a kind of a milieu of discourse on Armenian collective memory in which the novel is published. It has a particular time period of historicity. The link that I'm trying to draw here, that as we move forward in February, will be engaging with works such as Robert Nichols, and his particular work, Theft is Property, Dispossession, and Critical Theory. So we might think about how particular words might index a kind of larger vision of how we speak of genocide. But there are emerging bodies of scholarship in Armenian studies that we can read together and that can illuminate our study of the migration and memory, and the memory of migration. So I refer to the work of the abandoned property laws, referring to laws and decrees issued by Ottoman Turkish government to deal with what was happening to Armenian properties left behind. Bringing the bullet collection in conversation with such recent scholarship reveals the needed work of understanding nested memory in diaspora when the homeland is marked by the structures of dispossession that remain after removal. That is to say, we can juxtapose living through Lebanese civil war and feeling the past has not yet passed because of a fear of the end of ceasefires in that context, and then living in Turkey when the past has not yet passed because of settler economics, and what Melissa Bilal calls the structural continuations of genocide after the founding of the Republic of Turkey. As she explains, those structural continuations are reflected by a generation who could not study Armenian history as it was considered suspect and not included in the curriculum, the overall ignorance towards the presence of Armenians in a classroom and towards Armenian culture and religion in general, the ways in which the idea of multiculturalism in Turkey is directly related to the remembrance of violent annihilation of difference in Anatolia, and how the nexus of nation-state identity politics and remembrance practices inform an image of the past, present, and future of Anatolia in which Armenians are displaced. So to bring those bodies of scholarship, those critical bodies of scholarship emerging in Armenian studies, and the literary text to bear on one another means to ultimately do the following. It means to take up serious study of the lives of the removed. I am struck by instance for the announcement of this conference, especially the rhetoric of the removed as it was presented from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's press release. So shout out to Bedros Dermatosyan and the conference organizers. Little could you know that the event would become a material artifact for study by a literary studies scholar. Why the afterlives of the removed and not just the Armenian genocide? Remnants in Aleppo, as Hachi Murianian has showed us, we set up the Council of Refugees and compiled a list of deportees as part of a larger humanitarian resistance network. Orphans of the Nation, as Maud Mandel shows us in her work on the kind of French contemporaneous newspaper, we as Orphans of the Nation were the stateless who held Nansen passports, identified certificates used as travel documents, and that during and after World War II, we formed communities as displaced persons in Germany, and likewise held a status when forming communities in the US as a result of the Displaced Persons Act of 48. The removed, deportees, refugees, the displaced, and the stateless. Critical study of memory work helps us reflect upon the story of we who become together, and we who witnessed after the 1915 catastrophe. Second, it means to situate the narratives of we who become together and we who witnessed within a network. So shout out to Taler Shahinian, Sosi Kasparian, and Hachi Tololian. I don't know the decision process that went into selecting this new image for the cover of the journal, but I am sure glad you did, because I think it beautifully illustrates this notion of nodes and spokes of connection. That is, it can allow us to visualize how we think about a global Armenian peoplehood in terms of a network, where communities are nodes we study in relation, and spokes that connect. That we can imagine people moving between communities and thus carrying and producing memory across several sites. So we could say that there's an accumulation over time. Third, it means that in naming occurrences of nested memory, we can reflect on the different positions we held. So we could ask, how do narratives of Armenian exilees from the Lebanese Civil War point to Palestinian experiences of violence and displacement, such as the Sabra and Shatila massacre? In what ways do recollections of Iraqi Armenians demonstrate a witnessing of how US invasion and occupation affects non-Armenian community members? How do Armenian accounts of living in the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey index government-sponsored acts of violence carried out against other minorities, including Kurds and Alevis? I don't know the answers, but understanding nested memory within a system of nodes and spokes of connectivity can get us there. And certainly I think Kevork Murad's images can get us to really reflect when we think about, let's say, collective memory of the Syrian Civil War, the kind of other cultural memories that we can be nested within a larger collectivity. And then finally, it means to sit with nested sovereignty, to return to Simpson's work. And then imagine when all of this memory work arrives into a map of this place. I chose not to start this presentation with a land acknowledgement statement because I want those words to not just perform a particular rhetorical function within the academy. I want them to serve as the basis from which we proceed with thought and care in the meaning-making process of when nested memory of removal then comes and arrives and has contact points with nested memories of removal here. And it's on that point of arrival that I will arrive at the end of my presentation. So thank you all. Perfect.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. I think there's so much here that we can work with, and so many questions that I'm sure will come up. So I urge our audience to place their questions into the Q&A. We already have one question there. There are some interesting folks in the audience, including Nancy Gregorian, which we started off with. So it's a pity in a way that the sort of conversation that one would have in a room with everyone there does not translate into Zoom land, unfortunately. I have a question, and some of the, especially sort of the later things that you've now said, and the idea of narrative and the idea of one violent event is narrated in the context of a violent memory. And this sort of flows through your work, and especially your reading of Serafian Ward. And I'm wondering, and maybe this question is super obvious, but you've worked, of course, with Michael Rothberg, and so multi-directional memory comes right to my mind at that particular moment. And so maybe you can talk a little bit more about how you relate to his work and the idea of multi-directional memory.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Michael.
And he's in the audience as well, sorry.
Great, this is, moment of, narrating your own dissertation director's work to the larger public and thinking how that work relates to your own.
Sorry.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So those of you who don't know, so in the context of multidirectional memory, one way that we could think about this, Michael, hopefully I will do you justice. Know that I'm giving a talk right now live, so if I don't, bear with me, but I think it'll be fine.
I'm sure you'll do great.
But so certainly, as Michael's thinking through and thinking about the ways in which, let's say, collective memory and cultural memory of the Holocaust has borne ways and made legible other histories of collective violence, certainly in the context of other kind of colonial histories and the process of decolonization. Yes, that notion of connectivity is absolutely central to my work. And when I started writing about Ward's novel, I think the title itself of the article was Towards a Post-Memory and Multidirectional Memory Nexus.
Yes.
And then over time, as I worked with these other novels and then the memoirs, nested memory, that phrase to me was a way to bring those two frameworks together. So certainly, as I'm working through, I don't say we get rid of post-memory. I don't say we get rid of multidirectional memory, yeah. But I think about how those two come together and produce kind of a nexus. And so you could say in both kind of an expansion of thinking about points of connectivity. So not just histories that make other histories legible in terms of collective violence. Of course, we think across that way, but also temporally as we think about even the site of the family and these kind of, 3, 4, 5 generations, certainly in Solar Storms, that's what we see. And there's beautiful scenes in Solar Storms where Angel, the protagonist, I think it's like her great grandmother, there might be another great in there, is trying to narrate the experience of violence against Indigenous women. Mm-hmm. And so she's trying to narrate and like, what are the origins? What produced that violence? And so she narrates and she points to kind of like the boarding schools and residential schools. And she goes, no, it's actually much further than that. And then it's the environmental destruction. And it says, actually, no, it's even further than that. And then it's the arrival of settlers early on. And so it's this kind of constant linkage moving several generations of histories that are connected.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
But also generationally. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So actually, a question that Matthew Razarian, your partner in crime here, has put into the Q&A, sort of might lead this conversation even further. But he says, could you speak about the distinction between post-memory and re-memory in the discussion of the second orientation and the re-memory experience during the war? So I think I would add maybe perhaps that, and you've now already sort of gave us a little bit of a glimpse of post-memory as it functions cross-generational, but it might be useful to really sort of situate your work more clearly towards the Hirschian concept of post-memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we think about, again, another summary, hopefully I'll do justice, in post-memory. Now, Hirsch, of course, is working out of this in relation to the study of the Holocaust. She doesn't say it's exclusive to this context, but it is the context in which she's writing. And the notion that the second generation grows up in an environment of stories of, let's say, collective violence, of trauma, that certainly informs their relationship to a past that they didn't experience. So as a child, a descendant, didn't experience the Holocaust, but grew up in this kind of environment, and that those narratives certainly left some kind of a mark and understanding of the past, and it involves kind of investment and imagination because the child didn't actually witness that collective violence, but is relying on, either previous generations directly within the family, or let's say kind of horizontally across a generation kind of collectively. So the point of re-memory, as Hirsch is working through and thinking about the novel Beloved, is that moment if we think about the affective recall. So the post-memory structure could be an articulation of memory that is inherited. Let's say the descendant is then working through that inheritance. So if we look at Ward's novel, Mariana is in effect the third generation. So it would have been her parents who would have been the second generation in the novel, and that would be something more akin to what Hirsch has conceptualized with the relationship of post-memory, kind of this immediate generation after. So in the narration, Mariana isn't understanding what's going on with that memory as 2 generations prior are living through that trauma, are having that really affective response. So that rememory, and when Hirsch is kind of thinking through it, she's really calling attention to the kind of bodily response to it, and not just the narrative itself as it's passed down to the second generation.
Super interesting. Thanks. Okay, so I'll go to some other questions here. Annika Topelian, who is a graduate from the University of Michigan, now is asking you, how does your theory of nested memory intersect with findings from other disciplines, such as more recent psychological study of intergenerational trauma? What insight does your work have to offer to such research?
Yeah, so I think that is awesome. I would love to actually be more in conversation with psychologists and other individuals who work on this more with lived experiences. I will humbly admit that I haven't thought about that in relation yet, but I can certainly imagine that one model might be, if we think about the, let's say, narration, whether that's the narration, the recall of memory, because memory is always articulated as we speak it out loud, perhaps the tendency is to think about individuals who have experienced only one particular event of violence, or one particular event of collective violence. Yeah. And that notion, when we think about it in relation to, let's say, literary studies or in theory of, and the study of literature and art, the tendency has been to focus on a singular event of collective violence, but not to imagine that some of how all of these kind of different histories might be connected. So hypothetically speaking, I could imagine certainly someone who is 2 or 3 generations removed, let's say in the context of the Armenian genocide, who perhaps experienced the Lebanese civil war, or experienced, let's say, was there present in the context of the Nakba, then when experienced the Lebanese civil war, and perhaps even the Syrian refugee crisis and the Syrian civil war. So that might happen across generations. It might happen even within the experience of one individual. It is hypothetical, but I certainly suspect if we are to take a closer look at testimony, the testimony in diasporic memory would certainly show us that one event doesn't cut it, that there's several events that we actually have to think through and understand and provide a more holistic experience of how trauma affects individuals.
Interesting. This leads me kind of to a question about your authors. I mean, you have a great number of authors from different backgrounds. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the authors of your novels, and in particular, perhaps the one that you were speaking about in your talk, Serafian Ward. What is her relation? What is her sort of story? What is her kind of subject position as she's creating this beautiful work of literature?
Yeah, definitely. So Ward herself has, of course, a particular connection, and I ended up interviewing Ward as part of the article version that I wrote of this paper. And there's a lot to say, and she has a lot to say that's fascinating about the ways in which memory of genocide, and particularly family before, didn't narrate. And so there are particular reasons why, perhaps to not necessarily expose succeeding generations to that violence and those traumatic memories, and that's just what it was. And so I want to speak for Ward. I'll say that there are snippets of that interview that appear in that article in the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. I think critics have, in the study of Lebanese Anglophone literature, have tended to read the novel as autobiographical. Certainly, there are points of autobiography in the novel, but I tend to think of it as just, again, it's creative work, it's a work of fiction, and to not just read Mariana as Ward and to produce that kind of distancing. So yes, her biography is certainly informing the production of the text. I think the biographies inform all of the work of the authors in various different ways.
Okay, great. So we have 2 more questions here. One, of course, keeps us going with sort of the memory question here. And this is again from Matthew, and he says, can you talk more about the potential links and potential pitfalls between indigenous and diaspora, especially in the context of nested memory? Is nested memory a link where you can see a productive similarities? It's a really good question. That might also be a moment where you can bring in some of the other novels that you've put on the table, but of course didn't have time to address.
Sure. So I am. So, for instance, if we think about the work of Jenny Davis, and as she's thinking through, and why Indigenous and why diaspora together. So often in work outside of critical Indigenous studies, or let's say work even within, that tends to treat the study of Indigenous peoples, whether that's in the US and Canada or more globally, through an anthropological gaze that positions Indigenous peoples as part of the past and not as present. That indigeneity and this notion of belonging to a place prior to settler colonization is just something of the past. Whereas, for instance, one of the invocations that we see, I identified Audra Simpson as Mohawk, because that Simpson identifies herself in that sense with particular nation. Same with Jenny Davis as Chickasaw. Jody Bird as well as a Chickasaw scholar. So even the naming with, let's say, national or nationhood identities show us that that being Indigenous is not just temporally bound, but that it is spatially mobile, which often isn't discussed or seen or perceived and understood outside of the work of critical Indigenous studies scholars or in the context of Indigenous communities who live that reality. So the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a strategic move to think about diaspora as invoking and reflecting movement and mobility, to absolutely think about Indigenous peoples as also mobile, as also perhaps migrants and present in the present, and not just something, and not just in the past. So it does strategic conceptual work rooted in a particular study and rooted in particular ways of, let's say, American Indian and Indigenous Studies, Native American Studies programs were developed in the academy. Yeah. So what are the potential links and pitfalls?
Yeah.
Links that it allows us to think, again, of migration and mobility, but at risk is collapsing and teaching an audience as that established forms of diaspora in the context of, let's say, ethnic nations and nationhood is easily equatable. So it just means a lot of particularization that needs to happen, and that I can't always narrate in the context of giving a presentation, for instance. Sure. So solar storms, for instance, takes place in the context of the boundary waters across US and Canada. And so there's a figure who is a Chickasaw displaced. There's a reference to removal of Southeast tribes to Oklahoma Territory. Angel herself is removed from her family by the state and sent to a foster home in Oklahoma Territory. And then she moves across the boundaries of the US and Canada into further up north and what would be First Nations territory. So the notion of dispersion is getting us to different kinds of movements, even if the received notion of diaspora as a framework in, let's say, the context of like Armenian, Palestinian, Lebanese, so on and so forth, wouldn't apply in a one-to-one relationship.
Okay, great. So I'll ask one last question, which probably gets us a little thinking a little bit about the other genre that is part of your dissertation. Now book manuscripts.
This is a weird thing to say.
Yeah, we shall be correct on this one. So Ellen Whitehorn is asking, two teenage girl memoirs, diaries, that of Aurora Manoogian and Anne Frank, are often seen as personification of two major genocides. What are the strengths and limitations of memory literature as a lens on genocide? That's a big one. I don't know if that's answerable in you know, the time allotted here.
Sure. No, but I like it. I like especially that part where there's strengths and limitations of memory literature as a lens on genocide. So I think this is where I wrote, is it a question of genre? Is it a question of form? What is happening? I think in these literary case studies that, let's say in relation to genocide, aren't necessarily or cannot, as the survivor, because they aren't written by survivors, represent the genocide as a survivor. What they are doing, though, is producing theory for us. They're producing ways of thinking through the wake of genocide, the afterlives. It's kind of memory that it's moving. So I think perhaps what these literary texts are doing, not so much representing or trying to portray the genocidal experience, but what happens afterwards, how kind of kinship networks are maintained, how these memories are transferred or not transferred, what's coming to the fore. So I think that the strength of the literature is that it is giving us critical ways and critical lens to then think about what might have happened as lived conditions in the afterlives, in the wake of this experience. And there's something to be said to have a lens and think critically and reflect on that.
I think you beautifully articulated that right now. So thank you. So if there are no further questions, I will say thank you all for coming, and I will also say thank you so much to Helen for this really great talk and inspiring theoretical undertaking that you are putting to the table here. And I'm sure that in February, when we all are getting together, we will have lots more things to say about this. And I'm really looking forward to it, especially now after your talk. So thank you so very much. And thank you all for coming. And yeah, hopefully see you all soon.
Perfect. All right. Have a good evening, afternoon. Take care, everyone, and be safe.